66 million years ago, one rock changed everything. Not because it was the largest impact Earth ever suffered, not because it was unavoidable, but because of where it landed, and at what angle, and what happened to be in the ground at that exact spot. Scientists now believe the asteroid struck it close to the worst possible angle for life on this planet, hitting one of the relatively rare patches of Earth's surface, rich in sulfur-bearing rock. That collision blasted enormous quantities of sulfur into the upper atmosphere. The sunlight dimmed, photosynthesis slowed, then stopped across vast stretches of the planet. And the food chain, built from the bottom up over hundreds of millions of years, collapsed, arrive a few minutes earlier in its orbit. A few minutes later, the trajectory models suggest it hits open ocean. Instead, the sulfur stays in the ground, the sky stays lit, and the extinction, the one that handed this planet to the mammals, the one that made us possible, probably never happens. That is not science fiction. That is how close it was. In that other world, the one where the rock missed, the dinosaurs did not stay frozen in the Cretaceous. They had another 66 million years to evolve, the same span of time that separates us from the moment they were supposed to die. 66 million years of pressure, adaptation, and change. Some lines grew larger, some grew faster, some developed in directions that make the creatures we have fossil records of look primitive by comparison. And the mammals, our ancestors, never got the open world that was handed to them here. They had to share it, fight for it, build everything they became in the shadow of animals that never stopped evolving either. The question is not just whether humans would have survived in that world. It is what kind of world we would have built, and what would have been out there beyond the fence line that we could never fully tame. Today, we build that world from the science up and find out what waiting on the other side of that one small difference looks like. Before we do, if you enjoy content like this, hit the like button and subscribe, and let me know in the comments, is it late where you are right now, or are you starting your day with this? Now, let's step into the world where the rock missed. Long before highways, glass towers, satellite maps, or the quiet electric glow of cities at night, the planet belonged to a biological order, so old and so stable that it seemed permanent. Forests spread across warm continents, beneath heavy air, rich with oxygen and moisture. River systems wandered through fern plains and conifer groves that had already existed in recognizable forms for millions of years. Along their edges moved animals shaped not by chaos, but by refinement. Each lineage pressed slowly into greater specialization across spans of time almost impossible to picture clearly. By the late Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, dinosaurs had already dominated the land for roughly 165 million years. That length of time exceeds the entire evolutionary history of humanity many times over. They were not primitive experiments waiting to be replaced. They were the established architecture of the living world, occupying nearly every large terrestrial niche the planet could offer. The old image of dinosaurs as sluggish reptiles fading toward extinction has dissolved under modern research. Their bones preserve microscopic growth structures that reveal rapid development rates, metabolically expensive lifestyles, and body systems far more active than 20th century science once imagined possible. Some species reached enormous size while still growing quickly, something cold-blooded physiology could not sustain. Many likely maintained internal temperatures through elevated metabolism, occupying a biological middle ground very close to warm-bloodedness, and in some cases perhaps fully within it. Feathers appeared across far more lineages than paleontologists once suspected. Not merely decorative filaments, but complex structures with insulation, display functions, camouflage patterns, and eventually aerodynamic uses. Entire ecosystems moved beneath coats of color and texture, now lost to time, except for faint chemical traces trapped inside fossilized pigment cells. The social lives of these animals were equally intricate. Nesting grounds discovered in Mongolia, Argentina, and North America preserve colonies where adults returned season after season, tending young in organized groups. Trackways crossing ancient floodplains show coordinated herd movement over long distances, sometimes including juveniles protected near the center. Predator fossils found together suggest cooperative behavior in certain theropod species, though the exact structure of those hunts remains buried beneath deep time. While this enormous system expanded and adapted, mammals remained mostly hidden underneath it. Early mammalian species survived in shadows, occupying nighttime ecological roles too small or unimportant for the dominant reptiles to notice. They fed on insects, seeds, and scraps. Tiny jaws and delicate skeletons from the fossil record reveal creatures built for caution rather than conquest. The open daylight world belonged to something else. Most important of all, the dinosaurs alive at the end of the Cretaceous were not unchanged descendants of ancient Jurassic giants. Evolution had continued without pause. Brains in several lineages had become proportionally larger. Sensory systems sharpened, limbs grew more efficient. Some predators developed forward-facing vision suited for depth perception and rapid environmental processing. Others evolved highly specialized communication structures capable of carrying sound across enormous distances. The asteroid did not strike a stagnant world waiting for replacement. It struck a living system still experimenting with new forms of movement, intelligence, migration, and behavior. The process was ongoing when the sky changed. That small distinction settles quietly underneath everything that follows. At 7:43 on a Tuesday morning, the line of brake lights stretches almost 2 miles along the highway, east of Billings. Pickup trucks idle beside commuter sedans. Delivery vans hum softly in place. A public transit bus waits in the outer lane, with its doors folded shut against the cold prairie air. Nobody leans on their horn. Nobody leaves their vehicle. The stillness has the practiced rhythm of routine. Far ahead, beyond the first rise in the road, movement passes slowly across the asphalt in waves of gray-brown muscle and feathered hide. A movement report issued before dawn predicted herd activity through this corridor within a 90-minute window, and state law requires a complete traffic halt within 500 meters of an active crossing zone. The automated barriers lowered 20 minutes ago. Most drivers had already seen the alert on their phones before the traffic began slowing. The herd numbers roughly 340 animals, small enough that the crossing authority classified it as moderate density movement. Adults stand nearly 30 feet long from beak to tail and weigh several tons each, though their pace remains almost delicate, toes placing carefully against the pavement before pressing onward toward the river valleys farther north. Younger animals move within the middle ranks beneath the bodies of larger adults, sheltered inside the shifting walls of the group. In the third lane, a child watches silently through the window of an electric hatchback, both hands spread flat against the glass. 2 cars behind, someone lifts a phone above the dashboard to record the procession. A freight driver unwraps breakfast from silver paper and eats while checking updated route estimates. The traffic application has already redirected more than 14,000 vehicles towards secondary roads south of the migration corridor. The hadrosaurs barely acknowledge the stopped machines around them. Their kind has crossed this terrain since long before the mountains took their current shape. Fossil beds uncovered across North America, Europe, and Asia reveal how extraordinarily successful they once were, spreading across nearly every northern continent, during the closing age of the Cretaceous. Their mouths carried one of evolution's most elaborate feeding systems, dense dental batteries composed of hundreds upon hundreds of interlocking teeth, constantly replaced throughout life as grinding surfaces wore down against coarse vegetation. No grazing mammal ever evolved anything quite as mechanically sophisticated. That ancient machinery still survives inside these animals, though refined by another 66 million years of adaptation. The grasses they consume now are tougher than the cycads and conifers their ancestors once processed, yet their jaws move with patient efficiency, reducing stems and roots into fibrous pulp while they walk. Deep inside several adults, air passes through long hollow cranial chambers inherited from distant predecessors, producing low resonant calls too deep to travel clearly through human hearing. The sound arrives instead as pressure, a faint vibration inside the chest and steering wheel, passing through the waiting line of vehicles like distant thunder beneath the earth. The herd pauses briefly near the median barrier, where several juveniles hesitate at the edge of the pavement. Older animals gather around them instinctively, forming a loose crescent before continuing onward together. Paleontologists once uncovered nesting grounds that hinted at parental care among hadrosaurs. In this world, the behavior never vanished. It expanded, generation after generation, until migration itself became a kind of inherited memory carried socially across centuries. The roads curve where the animals travel because no engineer ever had the authority to decide otherwise. Survey maps, rail lines, utility corridors, and eventually interstate systems learned to bend around migration paths etched into the continent across geological time. 22 minutes after the barriers descended, the last animals disappear into the rolling grassland beyond the highway. Engines rise gently back into motion. The morning resumes its ordinary shape. Seen from above at night, the oldest cities of the alternate world resemble islands more than settlements. Pools of amber light gather on ridges, plateaus, and elevated stone shelves, where steep terrain narrows the number of directions anything large can approach from. Roads spiral carefully upward through controlled entry corridors. Freight depots sit behind reinforced transit gates. Residential districts cluster inward, denser near the center, looser near the outer rings where the land meets open country. Human civilization still followed rivers when it first spread across the continents. Water remained necessary for crops, transport, and trade. Conflict between human groups still shaped walls, watchtowers, and fortifications in the earliest eras of settlement. Yet over thousands of years, another pressure settled over architecture more completely than either war or commerce. The world contained animals massive enough to ignore boundaries entirely. A creature weighing 80 tons does not perceive a fence as a meaningful concept. It perceives shade, vegetation, water access, and migratory instinct. Even relatively calm herbivores alter landscapes simply by passing through them. One adult leaning its body against a structure can compromise stone supports designed only for weather and gravity. Early settlements learned this slowly. Archaeological layers beneath several ancient river cities preserve repeated rebuilding phases, where entire districts appear to have been flattened, not by armies, but by seasonal animal movement. As populations expanded, architecture changed with them. The transformation followed principles already faintly visible in human communities that coexist with dangerous wildlife in the modern world. In the Masai Mara, villages organize daily activity around lion movement. Livestock return before dusk. Paths between settlements remain open and visible. Children learn spatial awareness almost as early as language. Scale that pressure upward into animals, dozens of times larger, ranging across territories larger than some nations. and the geometry of civilization reshapes itself around avoidance. The cities that emerged from this adaptation abandoned the old fantasy of permanent barriers. Walls cracked, gates failed, trenches flooded. Modern urban perimeters function less like fortresses and more like layered sensory environments designed to discourage approach before physical contact ever occurs. Along the outer boundaries of major settlements, low-frequency acoustic emitters pulse continuously at ranges tuned to species common within the region. Some signals mimic territorial warnings. Others exploit frequencies associated with stress avoidance behaviors observed through decades of field research. Beneath the soil, chemical dispersal pipes release compounds derived from predator gland secretions, scents carefully calibrated to remain unpleasant to large herbivores while undetectable to humans drifting through nearby neighborhoods. Nothing in the system relies on one method alone. Ground vibration monitors buried beneath roads feed movement data into municipal tracking centers 24 hours a day. Thermal imaging towers rotate silently above industrial districts. Autonomous drones travel prescribed arcs beyond the perimeter, their routes adjusted nightly according to migration forecasts and weather conditions. Even ordinary apartment blocks near high-risk zones follow engineering standards unknown in our own world. Lower floors use reinforced composite framing capable of absorbing lateral force impacts far beyond conventional building requirements. Windows near street level are smaller, thicker, and slightly elevated, above average shoulder height for large browsing species. Emergency shelter corridors run through schools, hospitals, and transit stations with the quiet familiarity of earthquake exits in seismic regions. Over time, these adaptations became their own academic discipline. Universities founded departments of predator-adapted urbanism, blending ecology, structural engineering, behavioral science, and municipal law into a profession as established as medicine or architecture. Entire legal libraries now exist around incursion liability, zoning disputes, and migration corridor compliance. The result is a civilization shaped less by domination than negotiation with weight, instinct, and ancient movement patterns written into the land long before the first foundations were poured. Near the top corner of nearly every phone screen in the alternate world sits a small icon shaped like a moving contour line. Most people stop noticing it after childhood. It remains there quietly through grocery lists, train schedules, family photographs, and work messages, running in the background with the same permanence as electricity or weather. The application arrived slowly at first. Early versions were regional systems used by agricultural agencies and wildlife authorities, crude networks stitched together from scattered seismic monitors and radio dispatch reports. Over time, the infrastructure expanded outward until national governments absorbed it entirely. Today, in 34 countries, the software is legally required on every consumer device sold within monitored territory. Different nations call it by different names, translated through different alphabets and bureaucracies, though English-speaking regions settled on a simpler title long ago, the Movement Alert System, or MAS. The system gathers information continuously from thousands of separate instruments spread across the landscape, beneath highways, forests, grazing land, and river valleys. Vibration sensors rest several feet underground, listening to pressure waves moving through stone and soil. Above them, drone patrols rotate along programmed routes over migration corridors and known nesting regions, their infrared cameras sweeping silently across darkness and cloud cover. Satellite imaging updates at 90-minute intervals, measuring thermal disturbances large enough to separate animal movement from ordinary environmental change. Human reports enter the network as well, though filtered carefully through reliability algorithms that weigh location precision, historical accuracy, and response consistency. The result is less like a map and more like a living pulse spreading across the continent in real time. Most notifications arrive quietly. A level 1 alert appears as a green band sliding across the lock screen, informing nearby residents that large animal movement has been detected within roughly 15 kilometers, trending away from populated areas. No action required. People glance at it while standing in line for coffee or waiting beside train platforms, then continue with the morning. Behavioral studies conducted over the last 2 decades found that residents in high activity regions rank the alert tone as less emotionally disruptive than standard messaging notifications. Familiarity softened the sound into background texture. Higher levels alter the rhythm of daily life more noticeably. An amber level 3 warning indicates predatory movement within closer range, usually around 5 kilometers, with uncertain directional patterns. Schools suspend outdoor activity. Ranch workers begin mandatory position check-ins every 30 minutes through employer safety systems. Parents walking children home from evening programs choose illuminated pedestrian corridors monitored by municipal sensors. Red Level 5 alerts remain rare enough that entire neighborhoods remember where they were when the notification arrived. Phones vibrate simultaneously across apartment towers, office districts, and transit systems, with a tone reserved only for confirmed urban incursions. Exterior doors lock automatically in some districts. Public transport halts. Emergency response channels override commercial broadcasting frequencies. In heavily monitored regions, these events occur on average only a few times each year, yet each one leaves behind months of legal review, insurance negotiations, infrastructure repair assessments, and televised political debate. The scientific foundation beneath MAIS emerged from earthquake research developed during the 20th century. Seismologists learned long ago that movement travels through the earth in identifiable waveforms. Large dinosaurs produce signatures distinct enough that advanced systems can often classify species by gait rhythm alone. The spacing between impacts, the transfer of weight through the limbs, even subtle asymmetries caused by injury or age, create patterns recognizable to machine learning systems trained on decades of recorded movement data. For most residents, though, the science remains invisible. What matters is the quiet certainty that somewhere beneath the pavement and open ground, the world is always listening. The fluorescent lights inside the operations center never dim completely. Even at 3 in the morning, monitors continue glowing across the long curved desks, tracing movement paths through valleys, wetlands, industrial outskirts, and dark stretches of highway where sensor signals ripple quietly across the map. Coffee cools beside unfinished paperwork. Radios murmur intermittently from charging stations along the walls. Outside, somewhere beyond the perimeter fences, snow falls across several hundred square miles of monitored territory. A Territorial Response Service officer studies a thermal image projected across the central display. The shape moving through the timberline is large, but not moving with predatory intent. Head position low. Pace irregular, possibly injured, possibly searching for water after drifting beyond its established range. The distinction matters enormously. Every nation containing significant dinosaur populations maintains some version of this profession. The names vary with language and bureaucracy, though the structure remains strikingly similar from country to country. The work borrows pieces from wildlife biology, emergency medicine, military logistics, aviation safety, veterinary science, and law enforcement, yet belongs fully to none of them. No earlier human institution, prepared civilization for the existence of animals large enough to become environmental events the moment they entered populated space. Training lasts a minimum of 3 years before an officer receives independent deployment authorization. Recruits spend months learning to read posture, vocalization, eye movement, breathing rhythm, and herd spacing patterns the way physicians learn symptoms. A slight angle of the skull in one species may indicate agitation. In another, the same posture signals uncertainty or social signaling. Entire careers can hinge on correctly interpreting a movement lasting less than 2 seconds. Field exercises unfold inside carefully controlled preserves, where trainees practice acoustic deterrent calibration, vehicle positioning, and emergency civilian extraction procedures. Chemical sedation training occupies almost a third of the curriculum. Darts fired under real conditions may travel over 200 meters through wind, rain, vegetation, or low visibility. Dosage calculations depend on estimated body mass, metabolic condition, species physiology, and stress response, all determined rapidly in unstable environments. The pharmacology itself remains one of the most technically demanding branches of veterinary medicine ever developed. Sedating an animal weighing several tons without shutting down respiratory function requires compound combinations balanced almost to the edge of tolerance. Too little sedation leaves the animal mobile and distressed. Too much suppresses circulation before recovery teams can stabilize breathing. Researchers spent decades adapting anesthesia protocols originally designed for elephants, rhinoceroses, and marine mammals into formulations capable of functioning across entirely different evolutionary biology. Yet the physical danger is not what most officers describe as the hardest part of the profession. Every major intervention unfolds beneath legal scrutiny, so extensive that many deployments are documented more thoroughly than criminal investigations. If lethal force becomes unavoidable, review procedures begin automatically before the operation even concludes. Body camera footage enters evidence archives. Civilian witnesses submit testimony. Independent behavioral analysts reconstruct the event frame by frame to determine whether de-escalation remained possible. In 28 countries, officers involved in lethal incidents cannot return to active field duty until judicial review panels approve the decision formally. News networks broadcast analyses for weeks afterward. Editorials debate responsibility. Advocacy groups release competing reports. The animal becomes a public figure, despite never understanding the system built around it. Psychologists studying occupational trauma in the alternate world consistently place TRS personnel among the highest risk professions for long-term stress injury. The source is rarely panic or physical fear. Most officers resign after years of accumulated moral fatigue, worn down by the burden of making irreversible decisions inside situations where every available outcome carries loss somewhere within it. Still, before dawn each morning, the operations centers fill again. Weather reports arrive, patrol schedules update. Across immense territories, shaped by migration, instinct, and human settlement, someone has to answer the call when the map begins to move. The boundary markers appear ordinary at first glance. Wooden posts stand beside open pasture beneath pale stretches of sky, linked by wire fencing and faded warning signs carrying municipal registration numbers. On paper, the property belongs to a grain cooperative operating across 3 counties. Tax records, insurance contracts, and satellite surveys confirm it with bureaucratic precision. Yet every autumn, several thousand tons of living muscle cross directly through the center of it. The herd does not slow for fences because the route existed before fences became imaginable. Generation after generation has followed the same broad corridor between upland feeding territory and lower winter plains, guided by terrain contours, river orientation, mineral deposits in the soil, and inherited social behavior carried through the group itself. Young animals learn the path by remaining close to older individuals during migration seasons. The route survives not in geography alone, but in memory distributed across the herd. For centuries, property law attempted to ignore this reality. Human ownership systems evolved from agricultural settlement and urban expansion, built around the assumption that land exists primarily for human use. Wildlife occupied a secondary category, tolerated where convenient, removed where economically necessary. That framework functioned adequately while dealing with smaller animals whose territories could be fenced, diverted, or reduced without destabilizing entire regions. Large dinosaur populations made the assumption impossible to maintain. The first institutions to recognize the problem were not philosophers or conservationists, but insurance companies. By the late 19th century, agricultural loss records revealed a pattern impossible to explain through ordinary environmental risk models. Farms located directly along documented migration corridors suffered dramatically higher rates of structural destruction, crop loss, and livestock mortality regardless of fencing quality or defensive infrastructure. The predictive variable was not proximity to wilderness. It was overlap with routes established millions of years before the farms themselves existed. Actuarial tables forced a legal conclusion long before courts accepted it emotionally. Human deeds did not erase ancient territorial behavior. From this pressure emerged the doctrine of established territorial presence, one of the most unusual legal concepts in modern civilization. Under the doctrine, a continuously documented dinosaur population acquires recognized territorial status within its historical range. The territory does not become inaccessible to human development, but development inside it must account for the existing biological claim through mitigation systems, rerouting measures, seasonal accommodation corridors, or direct ecological compensation. Entire industries now revolve around proving or contesting these claims. Environmental law firms employ paleobiologists, migration analysts, behavioral ecologists, and geospatial historians to reconstruct centuries of movement data from fossil distributions, oral records, satellite tracking, and preserved sensor archives. Some court cases continue for decades, accumulating legal fees large enough to rival infrastructure megaprojects. The deepest complexity lies in the science beneath the law. Migration in large social animals is not instinct alone operating mechanically across empty terrain. It is learned structure. Older members guide younger ones toward water access points, shelter routes, mineral-rich feeding grounds, and seasonal timing windows synchronized with climate patterns. Disrupt the route severely enough, and the information itself disappears from the population. Once experienced navigators die without passing the behavior onward. The corridor vanishes not from the map, but from memory. Several regions learned this too late. During rapid industrial expansion in the mid-20th century, entire migratory systems collapsed after transportation projects severed long-standing movement paths. The immediate economic gains faded quickly beneath decades of ecological instability, increased urban incursions, and escalating agricultural conflict as displaced populations wandered unpredictably through territory they no longer recognized. Modern development therefore proceeds with an unusual form of caution. Surveyors studying new construction zones examine not only soil quality and flood risk, but behavioral continuity extending backward through deep time. The land beneath a city block may legally belong to a corporation or municipality. Beneath that ownership, though, another kind of history still moves slowly through the grass and river valleys, older than every document attempting to contain it. In the refrigerated aisle of an ordinary supermarket, rows of pale red cuts rest beneath soft white lighting while shoppers move carts slowly across polished floors. Packaging labels list fat percentages, grazing origin, hormone compliance certifications, and migration region codes. A grandmother compares prices beside a freezer stocked with smoked rangosaur sausage. Near the end of the aisle, a child asks for marinated tail strips prepared for grilling. Nothing about the scene feels unusual to the people inside it. The alternate world eats dinosaurs with the same quiet familiarity that our world eats cattle. Yet the animals raised for food are not simply captured from the wild and placed behind fences. The distance between a modern rangosaur and its hadrosaur ancestors resembles the distance between a dairy cow and the ancient aurochs from which cattle emerged thousands of years ago. Domestication changes behavior as much as anatomy. Across centuries of selective breeding, nervous systems adapt alongside muscle structure, reproductive timing, and social tolerance. Biologists studying domestication often point toward how remarkably rare the process truly is. Out of well over 100 large mammal species available to humanity across recorded history, only a small handful ever became genuinely domestic. Most animals fail one requirement or another. Some breed poorly in captivity, others panic under confinement. Many remain unpredictably aggressive regardless of upbringing. Successful domestication requires an unusual alignment of herd behavior, reproductive flexibility, dietary adaptability, and manageable stress responses. Several dinosaur lineages met those conditions surprisingly well. The ancestors of modern rangosaurs already moved in coordinated social groups long before humans began managing them systematically. They tolerated proximity to one another, consumed a wide variety of plant matter, reproduced in relatively predictable cycles, and possessed digestive systems capable of processing dense vegetation unavailable to most livestock species. Early agricultural societies gradually selected calmer individuals, generation after generation, favoring reduced aggression, lower flight response, and smaller body size more practical for controlled grazing. After 4,000 years of breeding, the resulting animals differ noticeably from their wild relatives. Domestic rangosaurs stand lower at the shoulder, mature more quickly, and exhibit reduced stress hormone spikes during transport or enclosure shifts. Their skin patterns vary widely through artificial selection, from dark slate coloration common in mountain stock to pale cream breeds favored in warmer climates where heat reflection improves metabolic efficiency. The industry surrounding them became enormous. Vast grazing cooperatives spread across prairie regions, unsuitable for dense urban settlement. Freight trains designed specifically for rangosaur transport move continuously between inland agricultural zones and coastal processing hubs. Veterinary genetics departments at major universities specialize entirely in livestock lineage management, balancing disease resistance against behavioral stability and nutritional yield. Not every dinosaur adapted to domestication so successfully. Smaller dromaeosaur descendants entered human society along an entirely different path. Their intelligence, cooperative instincts, and agility made them valuable as working animals long before industrialization. Rural households still keep feathered companion breeds descended from ancient hunting stock, animals capable of responding to dozens of learned commands while maintaining strong social attachment to human caretakers. In farming regions, they patrol storage structures for rodent control with quiet precision, weaving through narrow spaces impossible for larger animals to access. The great theropods resisted every comparable attempt. Solitary, territorial behavior, prolonged juvenile dependency, and severe stress reactions under confinement made stable domestication biologically unrealistic. Individual animals have occasionally formed bonds with handlers in research environments, though these relationships remain exceptional rather than reproducible. Governments maintain a handful of controlled facilities for behavioral study, but no industrial breeding system ever succeeded beyond isolated generations. As dinosaur agriculture expanded, moral debates followed closely behind it. Questions surrounding cognition, welfare, enclosure standards, slaughter practices, and emotional capacity entered public life with unusual intensity. Entire philosophical traditions emerged around the ethics of raising descendants of such ancient and behaviorally complex lineages for food. Discussions carried quietly through dinner tables, universities, and legislative chambers alike. On the first morning of school, before mathematics worksheets or alphabet exercises appear on any desk, the classroom lights dim softly, and the wall screen fills with moving silhouettes: broad neck, crested skull, feathered tail held level above the ground. The teacher pauses each image carefully, while small children repeat the names together in steady voices, learning shape before language has fully settled into memory. Every school inside monitored territory begins this way. The lesson does not carry the atmosphere of an emergency drill. It resembles the calm practicality of teaching children how to cross a road safely or recognize changing weather. Students learn which local species travel in herds, which remain solitary, which avoid human settlements almost entirely, and which behaviors signal rising agitation. A lowered crest angle in one animal may indicate stress. Repetitive pacing in another suggests territorial uncertainty. Distance matters. Wind direction matters. Sudden silence among smaller surrounding animals matters. By the end of the first week, most children can identify the 5 most common regional species by silhouette alone. Educational psychologists in the alternate world spent decades studying how this early exposure shapes childhood development. Their findings overturned many early assumptions. Adults once feared that constant awareness of large nearby animals would produce chronic anxiety in young students. Instead, children receiving structured behavioral education consistently displayed lower stress responses during real encounters than children raised without formal instruction. Familiarity transformed uncertainty into pattern recognition. Knowledge created orientation. The curriculum expands gradually each year. Primary students practice simulated alert responses tied to the movement alert system, learning what different notification levels require during transport delays, outdoor activities, or family travel. Older students begin studying migration timing, social grouping structures, and environmental cues affecting animal movement across seasons. In some rural districts, secondary school field courses include supervised observation sessions from reinforced monitoring stations where students document herd spacing and feeding behavior as part of ordinary science credits. By adolescence, many students possess practical ethological knowledge that would appear highly specialized in our own world. They understand how visual signaling differs between territorial and defensive displays. They can distinguish predatory scanning behavior from exploratory curiosity. They learn that most dangerous encounters emerge not from aggression, but from misunderstanding distance, stress thresholds, or movement pathways. This educational culture reshaped the academic landscape over generations. University admissions into behavioral science programs became extraordinarily competitive, surpassing law and medicine in some countries. Governments, insurance networks, conservation agencies, urban planning offices, and agricultural corporations all depend upon specialists capable of interpreting animal behavior accurately enough to reduce conflict across densely shared landscapes. The science underlying these programs traces back to early ethologists such as Nico Tinbergen and Konrad Lorenz, researchers who transformed the study of animal behavior by asking not only what animals do, but why they do it. Their framework expanded dramatically in the alternate world. Behavioral analysis moved from academic curiosity into daily infrastructure. Every public safety protocol, migration corridor policy, architectural standard, and territorial management system rests partly upon interpreting motive through observable action. Children therefore grow up inside a society unusually attentive to non-human intention. They learn early that another living creature may experience fear, territoriality, confusion, attachment, memory, or social obligation through systems entirely different from human thought, while still remaining understandable through careful observation. That habit of interpretation spreads outward into philosophy, religion, law, and ordinary conversation. In classrooms across the alternate world, this understanding settles quietly into place long before adulthood arrives. Chalk dust drifts through afternoon sunlight. Notebooks fill with sketches of track patterns and body posture diagrams. Outside the windows, beyond the edges of playground fences and athletic fields, the wider living world remains present enough that children learn to think about it not as scenery, but as another society moving alongside their own. Late at night, after traffic fades and household machinery settles into stillness, the air in dinosaur country never becomes entirely quiet. Curtains shift gently beside open windows. Water glasses tremble almost imperceptibly on kitchen counters. Somewhere beyond the visible dark, pressure moves through the ground and atmosphere together, arriving not as a sound exactly, but as a sensation the body notices before the mind does. Most residents stop consciously registering it by adulthood. The source lies partly inside the skulls of animals that inherited one of evolution's strangest acoustic instruments. The crest of Parasaurolophus, studied for more than a century through fossil reconstruction and airflow modeling, formed a long, hollow chamber curving backward through the skull like a natural brass instrument carved from bone. Digital simulations performed in the alternate world confirmed what paleontologists once only suspected. The structure functioned as a resonating system capable of generating extremely low-frequency calls extending into infrasonic range. Below roughly 20 Hz, sound drops beneath ordinary human hearing. The ear no longer interprets it as tone. The body experiences it differently, as chest pressure, faint vibration within the sinuses, a subtle, shifting sensation difficult to localize spatially. Modern elephants use similar frequencies to coordinate movement across several kilometers of open terrain. Their calls pass through ground and air simultaneously, carrying social information beyond the range of visible contact. Hadrosaur descendants expanded this communication system across millions of additional years of evolution. Entire herds remain linked through slow-rolling exchanges of infrasound that travel across plains, wetlands, and forest basins continuously. Researchers studying migratory coordination discovered that some groups maintain spacing accuracy during dense fog conditions almost entirely through acoustic signaling, too low for nearby humans to hear directly. The result changed the sensory character of civilization itself. People raised near major migration territory often describe distant urban centers as acoustically incomplete during their first months after relocation. Apartments in protected high-altitude cities feel unnaturally hollow at night. Rural migrants report difficulty sleeping despite the absence of danger or noise pollution. Psychologists studying the phenomenon eventually identified a recurring pattern. Residents accustomed to chronic low-frequency environmental vibration subconsciously associate total infrasonic absence with disorientation rather than safety. In dinosaur-adjacent regions, the pressure became part of ordinary life. Restaurants hum softly during seasonal movement periods. Windows carry faint sympathetic vibration before dawn migrations pass across nearby valleys. Campers sleeping beside protected corridors sometimes wake, moments before hearing any audible disturbance at all, alerted first by a physical sensation impossible to explain precisely. Engineers eventually learned to use the phenomenon long before fully understanding it biologically. Modern monitoring systems embedded beneath cities rely heavily on infrasonic detection arrays positioned miles beyond developed zones. A large herd approaching populated territory generates measurable atmospheric signatures roughly 40 minutes before appearing on thermal surveillance or seismic movement systems. That additional time became invaluable for transportation, rerouting, school scheduling adjustments, industrial traffic control, and emergency preparation during unpredictable migrations. Most people never notice the stations themselves. The instruments resemble ordinary weather infrastructure, small cylindrical housings mounted along ridgelines or buried beneath isolated utility compounds. They remain active continuously, listening to pressure waves drifting invisibly across enormous distances. Only when alerts activate do residents remember the network exists at all. The science surrounding these signals developed into one of the largest research disciplines in the alternate world. Bioacoustic laboratories analyze communication structure, herd coordination rhythms, territorial resonance behavior, and stress responses translated through infrasonic variation. Commercial industries emerged around the findings. Transportation planners designed quieter freight systems to avoid interfering with migration signaling. Urban architects test structural harmonics against low-frequency exposure. Behavioral management teams calibrate deterrent systems through carefully tuned acoustic disruption rather than physical confrontation. Across the alternate world, entire landscapes carry conversations far below the threshold of ordinary hearing, ancient exchanges moving patiently through darkness beneath the sleeping machinery of human civilization. From the observation windows of the departure terminal, travelers sometimes pause mid-conversation and glance upward as a shadow passes slowly across the cloud cover beyond the runway lights. Ground crews continue loading cargo without urgency. Air traffic controllers mark the movement automatically inside the regional aviation network. The delay board updates by 6 minutes. Nobody in the terminal reacts strongly enough to interrupt the ordinary rhythm of departure announcements and rolling luggage wheels. The skies of the alternate world never belonged entirely to aircraft. Long before birds diversified into the forms familiar today, another lineage mastered powered flight through an anatomy unlike anything else in vertebrate history. Pterosaurs evolved separately from both birds and bats, constructing wings from stretched membranes, supported primarily by a dramatically elongated fourth finger. Their skeletons combined extraordinary lightness with internal reinforcement structures capable of surviving immense aerodynamic stress. Hollow bones reduced weight without sacrificing strength, while broad chest musculature anchored to keeled sternums powered sustained flight over enormous distances. Among the final Cretaceous species, Quetzalcoatlus northropi remains the most studied. Standing as tall as a giraffe when grounded, it carried a wingspan approaching 11 meters while weighing roughly as much as 2 adult humans combined. Fossil mechanics research overturned early assumptions that such animals launched awkwardly from cliffs. Instead, they appear to have used all 4 limbs simultaneously in a powerful quadrupedal vault, an explosive movement with no modern equivalent among living flyers. In the alternate timeline, extinction never interrupted that evolutionary experiment. Over 66 million additional years, pterosaurs spread into ecological roles occupied in our world by seabirds, raptors, soaring scavengers, and high-altitude migrators. Some lineages became specialized ocean gliders, capable of crossing entire hemispheres on thermal currents. Others adapted to mountainous terrain with compact, maneuverable bodies built for narrow canyon hunting. Coastal species developed elongated sensory crests sensitive to subtle atmospheric pressure changes above storm systems, allowing migration timing accurate enough that shipping companies eventually incorporated pterosaur movement forecasts into long-range weather modeling. Their continued existence reshaped aviation from the moment humans first entered the air. In our world, bird strikes already represent a serious hazard to aircraft safety. Even relatively small impacts can disable engines or fracture cockpit structures at flight speed. The alternate world faced the same problem, scaled upward into something closer to collision physics than wildlife management. A large migrating pterosaur may weigh over 150 kilograms while traveling through shared airspace at significant velocity. Aircraft design adapted accordingly. The reinforced leading edges visible on commercial airliners are among the first details aviation enthusiasts learn to recognize. Wing fronts, engine nacelles, and cockpit sections contain layered composite shielding, engineered specifically for high-mass biological impact resistance. Testing facilities propel synthetic carcass analogs into prototype structures under controlled conditions, measuring deformation patterns down to microscopic stress fractures before certification approval. Airspace itself became partially biological territory. Seasonal nesting regions appear on aeronautical charts beside military exclusion zones and storm advisories. Some migratory corridors close automatically during breeding periods, forcing passenger flights to reroute hundreds of kilometers around concentrated aerial populations. Ticket receipts often include migration adjustment surcharges fluctuating throughout the year according to route complexity and fuel cost. Pilots train extensively in pterosaur encounter procedures. Flight simulators reproduce flock turbulence patterns generated by large winged animals riding thermal columns near commercial altitude ranges. Radar operators learn to distinguish biological formations from weather distortion through movement texture and density behavior. Airport lighting systems near coastal regions shift frequency during peak migration months to reduce nocturnal attraction patterns observed in younger animals. The result is an aviation culture permanently aware that the atmosphere remains shared habitat rather than empty transit space. High above illuminated cities and drifting cloud layers, ancient flight lineages continue tracing invisible routes through the dark. Their silhouettes crossing the same air currents, modern aircraft learned carefully to navigate around rather than through. Far offshore, beyond the last visible trace of coastline, cargo vessels move slowly through corridors mapped with extraordinary care. Navigation screens aboard the bridge display not only weather systems and shipping traffic, but feeding territories, migration density estimates, and seasonal aggregation zones, shaded in shifting layers of blue and amber. Captains study these overlays with the same attention earlier generations once reserved for storms. The ocean remained ancient territory long after humans learned to cross it. Mosasaurs emerged during the late Cretaceous as large marine reptiles descended from terrestrial lizard ancestors, distant relatives of modern monitor lizards that returned gradually to the sea and transformed into apex predators through convergent evolution. Their bodies lengthened into powerful swimming forms driven by muscular tails. Limbs flattened into steering paddles. Jaws evolved double-hinged flexibility, lined with recurved teeth, suited for gripping struggling prey in open water. The largest species stretched nearly 17 meters from snout to tail, heavier than an elephant and built for sudden acceleration beneath the surface. Fossilized bite patterns preserved on marine reptiles, ammonites, and even other mosasaurs revealed feeding behavior at the very top of the oceanic food chain. In the alternate timeline, those lineages continued evolving uninterrupted. Over millions of additional years, marine ecosystems shaped them into ecological roles, now divided among several different predators in our world. Some descended into deep cold currents with enlarged sensory organs capable of tracking electrical signatures through near total darkness. Others adapted to coastal ambush hunting, patrolling continental shelves where warm currents concentrated fish migrations. Pelagic forms crossed entire oceans, following breeding routes invisible from the surface, except through satellite observation and long-term tagging studies. Modern shipping industries therefore developed inside a permanently negotiated relationship with large marine life. International maritime agencies maintain continuously updated biological navigation charts, revised monthly through acoustic tracking buoys, underwater drone surveys, and migration telemetry gathered from tagged populations. Commercial shipping lanes shift seasonally around feeding concentrations, much the way aircraft alter routes around atmospheric turbulence. Insurance premiums fluctuate according to biological strike probability calculated for each corridor. Hull reinforcement standards changed accordingly. Cargo vessels operating through high-density marine reptile regions use layered composite plating around vulnerable lower structures, particularly near propulsion systems, where electrical vibration appears to attract investigative behavior from certain species. Shipping companies budget regularly for strike damage repairs caused not by deliberate attack, but by collisions with enormous animals surfacing beneath low visibility conditions. Offshore infrastructure faces even greater complexity. Wind farms, drilling platforms, and tidal energy stations all require active deterrent systems integrated directly into operational licensing agreements. Around submerged foundations, arrays emit synthetic electrochemical interference patterns designed to disrupt the sensory mechanisms marine reptiles rely upon while hunting. Mosasaurs perceive the world partly through electroreception, detecting faint biological currents generated by muscular movement in surrounding water. Their chemosensory systems track dissolved traces of blood, tissue, and metabolic byproducts across remarkable distances. Deterrence technology, therefore, functions less like a barrier and more like confusion. Artificial electrical noise saturates the surrounding water, while chemical emitters release compounds mimicking ecological conditions associated with low prey density or territorial competition. Engineers learned early that attempting direct confrontation with large marine predators produced unreliable results. Altering perception proved more effective than resisting force. Even recreation adjusted itself around these realities. Public beaches exist, though fewer in number and far more heavily regulated than in our world. Certified swimming zones depend upon specific combinations of depth, gradient, temperature profile, underwater topography, and current structure that naturally discourage large marine reptiles from entering shallow coastal water. Political debates surrounding beach certification can continue for years, balancing tourism economies against migration research and public safety assessments. Out at sea, however, no infrastructure fully belongs to humanity. Cargo convoys pass through darkness beneath rotating stars, while deep beneath them ancient lineages continue moving through cold pressure and open water, following instincts older than every shipping nation built above the tide. Near the edge of many alternate world towns, public parks include structures that appear unusual to visitors from elsewhere. Small reinforced shelters stand beside walking paths. Emergency lighting systems are mounted low to the ground rather than high above it. Children learn evacuation routes before they memorize multiplication tables. None of this feels dramatic to the people who live there. It settles quietly into the rhythm of ordinary life, absorbed so early that adulthood arrives already shaped around it. The human nervous system evolved beneath constant biological pressure. Long before cities, before agriculture, before written language, survival depended upon detecting movement in tall grass, interpreting distant sound, and recognizing danger quickly enough for the body to respond before conscious thought fully arrived. Deep within the brain, the amygdala became part of that ancient circuitry, calibrating itself over millions of years in landscapes where large predators were not rare interruptions, but permanent features of existence. In our world, much of that calibration no longer serves its original environment. The physiological cascade still activates, heartbeat accelerating beneath sudden noise or perceived social threat. Yet the ancestral source of those responses has mostly disappeared from daily life. In the alternate timeline, it never vanished. Psychologists in dinosaur-adjacent regions describe a condition known as predator proximate stress syndrome, though the term covers a remarkably broad range of experiences, from heightened environmental vigilance to severe trauma following direct encounters. The condition has generated the largest body of longitudinal stress research ever assembled. Entire careers have unfolded around studying how the human mind adapts when genuine large predator awareness remains woven into ordinary existence across generations. The findings unsettled many early assumptions. Populations living closest to managed dinosaur territory did not consistently display elevated rates of generalized anxiety disorder. In several countries, carefully controlled studies revealed the opposite pattern. Communities with formal education systems, reliable warning infrastructure, practiced safety procedures, and visible emergency competence often demonstrated lower baseline anxiety than dense urban populations far removed from biological threat. Researchers eventually identified perceived control as the decisive variable. Threat alone did not reliably produce pathology. Helplessness did. Children raised with clear behavioral knowledge developed measurable confidence in interpreting environmental signals. Adults accustomed to alert systems and rehearsed response procedures described danger as navigable rather than unknowable. Community drills, shared protocols, and visible public preparedness transformed enormous animals from abstract terror into manageable realities governed by rules people understood. The alternate world's therapeutic culture evolved accordingly. Clinical psychology emphasized competence building over reassurance. Treatment models focused less on eliminating fear than on integrating it into functional awareness. Patients recovering from traumatic encounters worked through exposure simulations, environmental literacy training, and collaborative preparedness exercises designed to restore agency rather than suppress memory. Social behavior changed alongside individual psychology. Communities exposed to recurring external threat displayed unusually high levels of mutual reliance. Long-term studies measuring neighborhood trust, volunteer participation, and emergency cooperation repeatedly showed stronger social cohesion in dinosaur-adjacent settlements than in predator-isolated metropolitan regions. Shared vulnerability appeared to strengthen collective identity in subtle but measurable ways. People checked on neighbors more often. Public drills achieved unusually high attendance. Information traveled quickly through informal networks long before official channels issued statements. Even architecture reflected this psychology. Public spaces favored visibility and multiple access routes. Residential developments clustered around shared courtyards and communal infrastructure rather than isolated private layouts. Safety became less an individual possession than a distributed social process. Beneath all of it remained the steady awareness that human beings were not entirely alone at the top of the world. The alternate timeline never allowed the illusion of complete separation from the surrounding ecosystem. Every alert tone, every practiced response, every quiet glance toward distant movement reinforced a psychological relationship our own species carried for most of its evolutionary history. The mind adapted not by forgetting danger, but by learning how to live beside it without surrendering to fear. Late at night, apartment windows across the alternate world glow with the pale light of live field feeds. Families fall asleep to migration trackers moving slowly across mountain valleys. Restaurants keep muted documentary channels playing above the bar. In quiet homes, far from perimeter regions, people still know the silhouettes of local theropods the way people in our world recognize weather patterns or constellations. The most watched broadcast in alternate world history began without ceremony. A perimeter camera in the Canadian Rockies captured movement shortly after dawn, an adult female theropod descendant entering the outer residential district of a city built against forested elevation. She weighed an estimated 6 tons and had crossed through a maintenance breach, opened briefly during storm repairs the previous night. The first footage arrived shaky and unfocused, recorded from several streets away through rain mist and low morning light. Within 40 minutes, nearly every major network had switched coverage. The broadcast continued for 11 uninterrupted hours. An estimated 2.3 billion people watched some portion of it live. Emergency analysts appeared beside behavioral scientists. Aviation channels carried perimeter maps. Public transit feeds embedded relocation updates between service notices. The animal itself remained almost entirely calm throughout the event. That calmness became the reason people could not stop watching. She moved through empty streets with deliberate attention, pausing often, head tilted slightly as if processing unfamiliar geometry. At one intersection, she approached a parked vehicle and pressed the side of her snout lightly against the driver's window, fogging the glass with breath before stepping away. Several minutes later, she stood motionless beneath a traffic signal while distant sirens echoed somewhere beyond the district perimeter. For 7 uninterrupted minutes, she did nothing at all. Behavioral scientists later analyzed those moments frame by frame. 14 peer-reviewed papers emerged from the footage, examining posture shifts, ocular fixation patterns, auditory orientation responses, and environmental scanning behavior. Tiny movements in the skull and neck suggested active sensory mapping rather than confusion. Researchers compared the behavior to large corvids, assessing unfamiliar objects, though scaled into an entirely different order of biological presence. The public watched with unusual stillness. No injuries occurred during the incursion. The animal sustained only a minor laceration during sedation deployment after the Territorial Response Service established a secure corridor and relocated her 18 kilometers north into protected territory. Yet the officer responsible for authorizing the DART sequence became globally recognizable for months afterward, interviewed repeatedly, despite visible discomfort with public attention. The event permanently altered alternate world media culture. Wildlife broadcasting had always occupied a central place in public life, but after the Rockies incident, live behavioral coverage expanded into something closer to collective observation. Documentary filmmaking evolved around patience rather than spectacle. The most respected broadcasters were not entertainers, but field biologists capable of remaining near enough to document behavior without disrupting it. Their credibility depended upon restraint, precision, and ecological literacy. Children memorized the names of famous migration researchers the way earlier generations remembered actors or athletes. University lecture clips discussing herd cognition accumulated audiences in the hundreds of millions. Slow-moving footage of nesting colonies, feeding rituals, or coordinated migration drew viewership numbers. Fictional dramas struggled to match. Part of this fascination emerged from danger, but not primarily. The deeper attraction came from proximity to minds that remained partly unreadable. Every documentary carried the sense that another intelligence was present behind the movement on screen, ancient and continuous, interpreting the world through sensory systems shaped across millions of years of parallel survival. Entertainment, therefore, became inseparable from observation. Watching these animals was never fully passive. It carried the quiet awareness that the creatures being filmed were also watching back, measuring the perimeter of human civilization with their own unknowable understanding. In lecture halls across the alternate world, philosophy students begin with a problem that earlier civilizations rarely needed to confront directly. The discussion no longer starts with abstract thought experiments about distant minds or hypothetical machines. It begins with field footage, behavioral records, and legal testimony gathered from living animals moving through forests and mountain corridors beyond the edges of human settlement. The question sounds ancient, but in the alternate timeline, it became impossible to keep distant. For centuries, human ethical systems developed around an assumption so deeply embedded that few people noticed it. Intelligence existed on a ladder. Humans occupied the top. Everything else stood somewhere beneath, differing mainly by degree of instinct, memory, or emotional complexity. Animals could suffer, perhaps even feel attachment, yet the moral structure itself remained comfortably stable because no non-human species consistently approached the cognitive territory reserved for people. Then the troodontid data accumulated. Troodontids at the end of the Cretaceous already possessed unusual neurological traits among non-avian dinosaurs. Fossil endocasts indicated enlarged brain regions associated with sensory integration and coordination. Forward-facing eyes produced stereoscopic vision. Their forelimbs retained partial grasping capability. Evidence of parental care and cooperative behavior appeared repeatedly in nesting sites scattered across the fossil record. In the alternate world, that lineage never disappeared. Across 66 million additional years, certain descendant populations developed behaviors that steadily eroded the boundary, separating sophisticated animal cognition from something more difficult to categorize. Long-term studies documented novel hunting strategies transmitted socially across generations rather than inherited genetically. Juveniles learned route planning and environmental assessment through observation of older group members. Cleared pathways through dense terrain reappeared season after season, maintained collectively and modified gradually over time. One mountain population became the center of international attention after researchers documented a sequence of mourning analogous behaviors following the death of an injured adult. Group members returned repeatedly to the location over several days. Feeding activity decreased measurably. Vocalization patterns shifted into unusually low-frequency contact calls not associated with territory or hunting behavior. Structural analysis of movement and interaction patterns matched criteria previously used to identify grief responses in elephants and great apes. Philosophy departments struggled to absorb the implications. The standard framework for moral patiency, the capacity to possess interests that ethics must recognize and protect, evolved within a mammalian-centered understanding of intelligence. Consciousness debates revolved around dolphins, primates, corvids, and cetaceans. The possibility of a large non-mammalian predator demonstrating socially transmitted knowledge, environmental modification, and mourning behavior at this level had never been part of the conceptual architecture. Legal systems moved first, though unevenly. 28 countries eventually established protected cognitive status classifications for certain troodontid descendant populations. The language varied across jurisdictions, but many statutes borrowed terminology from human rights law rather than traditional wildlife regulation. Legal scholars spent decades debating whether these protections represented expanded conservation policy or the earliest form of non-human personhood doctrine. Religious traditions adapted more slowly. Some theological schools interpreted cognitively sophisticated dinosaurs as evidence that consciousness itself emerged repeatedly through creation rather than belonging exclusively to humanity. Others argued that intelligence without civilization remained spiritually distinct from human existence. Entire councils assembled around questions that previous centuries treated as peripheral curiosities. Sermons, legal arguments, and academic journals circled the same uneasy realization from different directions. The animals themselves remained indifferent to the debate unfolding around them. Out beyond the monitored zones, beneath forests older than recorded history, troodontid groups continued teaching their young where water gathered after dry seasons and which valleys carried sound furthest at dusk. Human philosophy expanded outward, trying to contain what the behavioral evidence suggested, while the living subjects of that evidence kept moving quietly through the dark, carrying forms of awareness the existing language of ethics could describe only imperfectly. At research stations built along remote mountain ridges, scientists sometimes spend entire winters watching the same valley through thermal scopes and motion-sensitive cameras. Weeks pass with almost nothing visible except drifting snow and distant tree movement. Then, briefly, a hunting group appears between the trunks, coordinated so precisely that the footage is replayed for years afterward in universities and legal hearings across the alternate world. The unease surrounding troodontid intelligence does not emerge from a single discovery. It emerges from accumulation. By the end of the Cretaceous, the troodontid lineage already stood apart from most non-avian dinosaurs in several measurable ways. Their skull cavities suggested unusually large brains relative to body mass. Forward-facing eyes provided stereoscopic depth perception associated with active predation. Semi-grasping forelimbs retained dexterity uncommon among large theropods. Nesting evidence implied prolonged parental investment rather than simple egg deposition followed by abandonment. Most importantly, they lived socially. That detail changed everything once 66 million additional years of evolution continued applying pressure to the lineage. Across vertebrate history, one pattern appears repeatedly. Species navigating complex social environments tend to develop increasing neurological sophistication over time. Primates, corvids, dolphins, elephants, and certain carnivores all display versions of the same trajectory. Tracking alliances, predicting rivals, remembering relationships, and coordinating group behavior create evolutionary pressure, favoring larger and more flexible cognitive systems. This became known as the social brain hypothesis. Troodontid descendants in the alternate world evolved beneath precisely those conditions for geological timescales longer than the entire evolutionary history separating early primates from modern humans. Their social groups hunt cooperatively, divide roles during movement, and maintain long-term territory familiarity transmitted across generations. Behavioral literature documenting these patterns fills entire libraries. Yet the central question remains unresolved. Researchers examining observed behavior divide broadly into two interpretations. The first remains cautious. According to this view, troodontid descendants display extraordinarily advanced operant conditioning reinforced across generations. Animals repeat behaviors producing successful outcomes. Social learning accelerates the spread of effective strategies. Complex-looking patterns emerge naturally through accumulated trial and error without requiring anything equivalent to deliberate reasoning in the human sense. Under this interpretation, the animals appear strategic without actually modeling strategy consciously. The second interpretation is more unsettling. Certain researchers argue that repeated observations suggest intentional outcome prediction rather than conditioned repetition alone. Hunting groups alter approach routes after encountering surveillance systems. Juveniles appear to learn through guided observation rather than independent experimentation. Some populations adapt to environmental changes with a speed difficult to explain through reinforcement processes alone. Behavioral variation spreads socially even when immediate survival advantage remains unclear. In one widely discussed field study, a juvenile troodontid repeatedly failed at accessing food secured beneath a weighted latch. An older group member then manipulated the mechanism while the juvenile watched from nearby. Subsequent attempts by the juvenile succeeded immediately, with no intermediate trial period. The footage circulated internationally because researchers could not agree whether it represented simple mimicry or deliberate instruction. Technology cannot currently resolve the disagreement. Brain imaging requires sedation protocols too dangerous for extended cognitive observation. Linguistic frameworks fail because communication systems evolved entirely outside mammalian structures. Behavioral evidence remains indirect, interpreted through statistical models and comparative cognition studies built originally around primates and corvids rather than large predatory reptiles. The uncertainty itself reshaped entire academic disciplines. If the cautious interpretation proves correct, the alternate world shares the planet with the most behaviorally sophisticated, non-human predator in evolutionary history. If the second interpretation proves correct, then another category may already exist quietly beyond the perimeter zones, neither human nor merely animal in the traditional sense, but something occupying unfamiliar cognitive territory between the two. For now, the forests continue holding their silence. Cameras record movement through snowfall and darkness while scientists argue over what exactly is looking back through the trees and how long it has been learning to do so. Snow arrives early in the northern Rockies, settling across the valleys in long pale bands that remain untouched for days except where animals pass through. From observation towers hidden among the trees, researchers study those tracks each morning before wind softens the edges. Over decades, the patterns became familiar enough that small changes stood out immediately. A route shifted slightly east, a resting site abandoned, a hunting formation tightening where it once spread wide. The behavioral study began quietly. 34 years earlier, a consortium of universities established a continuous monitoring program focused on a single troodontid descendant population occupying several hundred square kilometers of mountainous territory. The original proposal sounded modest by scientific standards. Researchers intended to document baseline ecology across generations, territory boundaries, reproductive cycles, prey selection, social ranking structures, and seasonal movement patterns. At first, the data followed expectation. Group territories remained stable. Hunting formations repeated predictably. Juveniles learned through observation of adults. Sensor networks embedded across the valley collected thousands of hours of thermal movement records, acoustic signatures, and feeding site activity. The study promised to become one of the most complete long-term predator datasets ever assembled. Then, year 7 arrived. Researchers noticed that the population had stopped entering a specific section of forest during daylight hours. The avoidance zone corresponded closely with a Territorial Response Service patrol route established 3 years earlier after increased perimeter activity farther south. At first, the overlap appeared coincidental. Large predators alter movement behavior for many environmental reasons: prey migration, weather variation, human disturbance, wildfire recovery, yet the timing became difficult to dismiss. The animals avoided the corridor only during active patrol windows. When the patrol schedule changed in year 9, the avoidance pattern shifted within weeks. Another schedule adjustment in year 11 produced the same response. Statistical models eventually demonstrated temporal precision beyond random probability. The research team divided almost immediately over interpretation. Some argued the explanation remained simple. The patrol vehicles generated noise, scent traces, and environmental disruption. Animals learned through repeated exposure that the corridor became less favorable during certain hours. No advanced cognition required. Others felt the synchronization implied something more complex, a learned recognition of recurring human behavioral structure rather than mere disturbance avoidance. The controversy deepened in year 14. 2 juvenile troodontids developed a modified hunting approach pattern never previously observed within the population. Instead of driving prey through open terrain toward traditional ambush points, they maneuvered through irregular geological folds where surveillance coverage weakened. The route consistently exploited shallow sensor blind spots created by elevation, interference, and dense mineral outcroppings beneath the valley floor. No adult animals initially displayed the behavior. By year 22, nearly every hunting age member of the population used the same approach strategy. Juveniles adopted it early. The behavior spread socially across the group despite existing methods remaining successful. Researchers reviewing decades of footage found no evidence that the pattern had appeared before the younger generation introduced it. Peer review became unusually tense. The paper presenting the year 22 findings accumulated more reviewer commentary than any publication in the journal's history. Entire sections focused not on statistical methodology, but on conceptual discomfort. Critics warned against anthropomorphism. Supporters countered that rejecting evidence because it resembled strategic reasoning too closely represented its own form of bias. Beneath the academic language rested a far more unsettling possibility. If the true-daunted population had merely discovered more efficient terrain usage, the implications remained manageable. Predators adapt constantly. Ecosystems shift. But if the animals had recognized the surveillance network itself as a system with predictable limitations, then they had demonstrated a form of abstract environmental modeling associated with very few known intelligences. Every recognized example of that category already occupied a legal status beyond ordinary wildlife. Out in the Rockies, meanwhile, the population continued moving through snow-covered valleys beneath silent observation towers, passing generation to generation through landscapes increasingly shaped by human infrastructure, while perhaps beginning, slowly and deliberately, to shape their own behavior around humanity in return. At certain times of year, satellite images of the northern hemisphere reveal pale rivers moving across the continents. They are not clouds, storms, or dust carried by wind. They are herds, immense migrations stretching for kilometers, flowing through forests, grasslands, wetlands, and mountain passes with the same directional certainty. Their ancestors followed long before the first border post or customs checkpoint appeared on Earth. A migratory hadrosaur population may begin its seasonal movement in territory administered by one government, cross two international boundaries over the course of several weeks, and end the migration in a coastal basin belonging to an entirely different political system. The animals do not pause at fences. They do not recognize languages, constitutions, or treaties. Their routes were established by geography, water access, and vegetation cycles millions of years before human sovereignty existed. Human civilization adapted afterward. The diplomatic structure that emerged from this reality became one of the most intricate legal systems in the alternate world. Dinosaurs are simultaneously protected wildlife, agricultural disruption, scientific treasure, economic resource, tourism foundation, and territorial presence claimant. No modern category fully contains them. Every government with major populations learned that domestic policy alone could not manage creatures whose ranges ignored political maps entirely. The result was the Dinosaur Territory Convention. First signed more than 2 centuries earlier, the treaty has been renegotiated 14 separate times as science, technology, and public ethics evolved. 89 countries currently participate. Its administrative headquarters occupies an enormous complex in Geneva, where more than 4,000 staff members manage migration data, arbitration proceedings, ecological monitoring standards, emergency response coordination, and territorial compliance review. Entire diplomatic careers exist within its framework. The most disputed section remains Article 23, a provision whose language has triggered parliamentary crises, trade retaliation threats, and several near collapses of treaty negotiations. The issue appears narrow at first glance. It governs lethal management authority during cross-border incursion events. In practice, the implications are enormous. If a large theropod descendant originating from one nation crosses into another during an active emergency, whose legal standards apply when response officers decide whether lethal force is justified, the answer determines criminal liability, insurance jurisdiction, compensation responsibility, and diplomatic accountability simultaneously. Countries with strong established territorial presence protections argue that the originating population retains legal continuity regardless of location, Nations with weaker protections reject that interpretation, insisting sovereignty applies within current borders alone. A single incident involving a protected breeding female can generate years of litigation and diplomatic tension. Behind the legal arguments rests something deeper than policy. Nations possessing large dinosaur populations hold a geopolitical asset unlike any resource in our own world. Living dinosaur ecosystems generate scientific prestige, tourism economies, pharmaceutical research opportunities, educational influence, and cultural identity powerful enough to shape international perception. Biological uniqueness became a form of soft power. Universities cluster around stable migration territories. Documentary industries flourish beside major nesting grounds. Pharmaceutical laboratories compete for access to proteins, immune responses, and metabolic adaptations unknown elsewhere in vertebrate biology. Even national symbolism changed. Flags, currencies, military insignia, and diplomatic ceremonies increasingly incorporated endemic species whose populations existed nowhere else on Earth. Countries that industrialized aggressively during earlier centuries sometimes eliminated their native dinosaur populations entirely through habitat destruction and unregulated expansion. At the time, the decision appeared economically rational. Decades later, the consequences hardened into permanent strategic loss. They surrendered ecological capital that cannot be recreated. Modern international negotiations quietly reflect this imbalance. Nations with thriving populations command disproportionate influence within scientific councils, conservation treaties, and environmental trade agreements. Their protected territories attract funding, researchers, and diplomatic partnerships on a scale unavailable to countries whose landscapes have fallen silent. Yet the arguments unfolding between governments remain calmer than those unfolding inside them. For every citizen who sees the animals as inheritance, another sees insurance costs, restricted land use, damaged crops, delayed infrastructure, and lives organized around constant accommodation. In legislative chambers across the alternate world, the deepest political divisions rarely concern whether the animals matter. They concern how much human life should bend around them. Election maps in the alternate world possess a pattern recognizable from orbit. Dense urban interiors glow with one set of political priorities, while the outer territories surrounding migration corridors, nesting grounds, and predator ranges form another. The divide is so stable that political scientists sometimes describe it less as ideology and more as ecology expressed through voting behavior. People living along the perimeter wake to a different relationship with the land. A rancher in the Western Plains checks fencing integrity before sunrise because a damaged barrier can mean the loss of an entire season's livestock in a single night. Orchard workers coordinate harvest schedules around movement alerts. Freight routes change according to seasonal crossings older than agriculture itself. Children learn the silhouettes of local species before they learn national geography. For interior populations, the animals exist differently. A resident in a mountain arcology or dense coastal city may spend years without seeing a wild dinosaur outside a documentary stream or monitored reserve. Their experience is mediated through research broadcasts, museum exhibitions, tourism campaigns, and legislative debate. The danger feels distant, statistical, filtered through infrastructure designed specifically to keep it that way. From these separate realities emerge two political cultures that rarely trust one another completely. Perimeter voters consistently support expanded authority for territorial response service officers during emergency encounters. They favor faster approval for defensive action, reduced litigation barriers following lethal management events, broader compensation systems for agricultural damage, and personal access to deterrent technologies calibrated for civilian use. To them, these policies are practical accommodations to daily life, no different from flood infrastructure in river regions or earthquake standards along fault lines. Interior voters tend toward different conclusions. They support expanded, established territorial presence protections, stricter oversight of lethal interventions, stronger conservation mandates, and broader legal recognition for cognitively sophisticated species. Many favor increased public funding for coexistence infrastructure rather than expanded removal authority. Their perspective is shaped by the belief that humanity entered an ancient ecological system and therefore carries an obligation to adapt itself accordingly. Neither side experiences its position as abstract morality. Both are responding to conditions that genuinely exist around them. A perimeter farmer who loses half a year's income after a migration breach is not imagining the burden. An interior behavioral scientist documenting social learning in troodontid descendants is not inventing the ethical implications of what she observes. The conflict persists because both realities are materially true at the same time, yet unevenly distributed across geography. The political imbalance emerges from population density itself. Perimeter territories are vast, hazardous, infrastructure-intensive, and comparatively sparsely populated. Interior cities concentrate millions of people inside heavily protected zones where exposure risk approaches zero. Democratic systems built around proportional representation therefore amplify the preferences of citizens least directly affected by the animal's physical presence. This imbalance has generated resentment durable enough to shape entire parties, regional movements, and constitutional reform campaigns. In several countries, perimeter blocks have demanded partial local autonomy over incursion policy, arguing that communities carrying the highest physical risk should possess expanded authority over management decisions made on their land. The underlying scientific pattern is not unique to the alternate world. Conservation researchers, in our own timeline, documented smaller versions of the same phenomenon wherever large predators survived alongside humans. Wolf recovery programs, bear management disputes, and shark protection policies repeatedly revealed a tension between direct lived experience and distant ethical preference. The alternate world simply magnified the scale until it became impossible to ignore. Over time, the argument stopped being solely about the animals. It became an argument about whose knowledge counts most, the knowledge gained from living beside danger every day, or the knowledge gained from studying the larger system from a safer distance. Before the first human boundary marker entered the ground, the continents already contained territories. Rivers curved through them. Forests thickened and retreated with climate cycles, and immense migratory paths crossed the land in repeating patterns older than mountains in some regions. In the alternate world, those routes never disappeared into extinction. They remained active, visible, and continuously occupied by descendants of the same animal lineages that had traveled them for millions of years. This created a historical condition with no true equivalent in human experience. Every road, city, farm, and nation was constructed inside landscapes already inhabited by populations whose territorial continuity vastly exceeded the lifespan of human civilization itself. The evidence was not symbolic or mythic. It existed physically in the fossil record and in the living world simultaneously. Paleontologists could trace a hadrosaur migration corridor through layered rock formations reaching deep into geological time, then stand in the same valley and watch modern descendants moving across the identical terrain. The continuity was measurable. Bone beds appeared repeatedly in the same floodplains, separated by millions of years. Nesting grounds persisted across climate shifts and continental rearrangements. Ancient trackways, preserved in stone, aligned with modern migration paths detected by satellite and seismic monitoring systems. Long before governments mapped borders, the animals had already mapped the land through repetition. Human institutions struggled to absorb what this implied. Early industrial development treated dinosaur territory as an obstacle rather than an established system with its own continuity. Railways cut through migration corridors. Agricultural expansion spread across feeding grounds. Urban growth consumed nesting basins because the terrain was fertile, accessible, and economically valuable. The consequences arrived with exhausting predictability. Crops were destroyed season after season in the same regions. Infrastructure repair costs mounted continuously. Insurance markets destabilized under repeated compensation claims. Entire transportation systems required redesign because the routes humans preferred overlapped with routes older than human settlement itself. Governments initially framed the problem as wildlife management. Over time, the language changed. Lawmakers and courts slowly recognized that the animals were not intruding into human systems in the ordinary sense. Human systems had been inserted directly into territories already occupied for immense stretches of uninterrupted biological time. Established territorial presence law emerged from this realization, not from sudden philosophical idealism, but from the practical failure of every framework that ignored prior occupancy. Once the legal shift began, the cultural shift followed behind it. The alternate world gradually developed a concept of civilization less centered on permanent conquest and more centered on negotiated coexistence. Urban planning, environmental economics, infrastructure, engineering, and education all absorbed the assumption that human expansion existed inside a larger ecological continuity rather than above it. Children learn this history early. They grow up understanding that the oldest pathways on Earth were not highways or trade roads. They were migration routes shaped by memory, terrain, water access, and social transmission across spans of time so vast that recorded human history occupies only a thin surface layer above them. The comparison to indigenous displacement appears often within alternate world philosophy and law. Scholars debate it carefully because both involve questions of prior presence, territorial continuity, and the consequences of expansion. Yet the alternate world contains one difference impossible to separate from the discussion. The prior inhabitants never vanished into the past. They remain present, moving across the same valleys and plains beneath modern satellites, crossing territories where human civilization arrived recently by comparison, carrying patterns of life older than nearly every institution humanity has ever built. Deep inside the northern Rockies, beyond the last permanent research outposts and the final maintenance roads, there are valleys where monitoring towers stand among the trees like quiet metal reeds. Thermal cameras rotate slowly through the dark. Seismic sensors remain buried beneath frozen soil. Drone routes overlap in patient geometric patterns above the forest canopy. Every movement through the region is recorded, cataloged, and compared against decades of accumulated behavioral data. For most species, the system works as intended. Migration timing becomes predictable. Population stress can be measured indirectly through movement irregularities. Hunting ranges stabilize under observation. Conservation biology, at its core, depends on the assumption that animals respond to conditions without understanding the structure of the system observing them. The alternate world discovered a possible exception. The troodontid descendant populations under long-term study began exhibiting behavioral shifts too precise to dismiss easily. Patrol avoidance correlated not simply with the presence of response teams, but with their schedules. Certain hunting paths appeared concentrated in topographical dead zones where sensor overlap weakened. Juvenile animals adopted these routes more efficiently than older adults, suggesting social transmission rather than isolated discovery. None of the individual observations proved intentional reasoning on their own. That uncertainty became the center of the problem. Conservation biology had never needed to distinguish clearly between adaptation and comprehension. A wolf learning where fences are weakest does not necessarily understand the concept of fencing infrastructure. A crow exploiting traffic lights for nutcracking demonstrates remarkable intelligence, yet still operates within cognitive categories human researchers consider manageable. The troodontid data occupied a stranger territory. If the animals were merely responding to successful outcomes reinforced over generations, the standard management framework remained fundamentally sound. But if they were modeling the human system itself, even imperfectly, then every management action carried a second layer of consequence. The monitoring network would no longer function solely as containment infrastructure. It would become a source of information for the population being contained. The paradox emerged quietly from this possibility. A conservation system designed to manage cognitively flexible predators might also create selective pressure favoring precisely the traits that make management harder. Animals better at navigating monitored landscapes survive encounters more consistently. Those survivors reproduce. Offspring inherit not only genetic predispositions toward higher cognitive flexibility, but socially transmitted behavioral knowledge accumulated from previous generations. Over decades, the system begins shaping the population, not intentionally, not maliciously, simply through evolutionary pressure operating in real time beneath layers of policy, research grants, and field protocol. The scientists publishing these findings speak with extraordinary caution. Their papers avoid dramatic language. Statistical limitations are acknowledged repeatedly. Alternative explanations receive entire sections of analysis. Yet the unease surrounding the research does not come from sensationalism. It comes from how ordinary the mechanisms appear once described clearly. Natural selection does not pause because humans are observing it. If anything, observation becomes part of the environment itself. Some conservation researchers now compare the situation to an evolutionary mirror. Human civilization constructs increasingly sophisticated systems to predict and regulate behavior. The animals encountering those systems adapt in response. Humans then redesign the systems again. Each side alters the conditions shaping the other, not through deliberate conflict, but through continuous coexistence inside the same ecological space. No textbook prepared conservation science for this. Traditional wildlife management assumes the gap between human strategic planning and animal cognition remains permanently wide enough for control systems to function predictably. The troodontid studies suggest the gap may be narrower, more dynamic, and more unstable than anyone previously believed. At the edge of the research, the language itself begins to thin. Terms like management, adaptation, deterrence, and behavioral conditioning no longer feel entirely sufficient for what the data may be describing. And whenever science reaches the point where its categories stop fitting cleanly around reality, philosophy arrives quietly beside it, waiting in the dark, with older questions about mind, intention, and what it means to truly understand another living thing. The difficulty begins quietly, inside language itself. Scientific papers become longer over the decades, not because the evidence grows less precise, but because the vocabulary inherited from earlier centuries no longer fits cleanly around what researchers are observing. Words like instinct, conditioning, intelligence, and agency begin to lose their stable edges. Each term was shaped in a world where humans occupied a cognitive category entirely alone. For most of history, that separation structured civilization automatically. Animals could be dangerous, useful, beautiful, or emotionally significant, yet the underlying relationship remained simple. Humans generated abstract law, symbolic religion, cumulative engineering, and recorded history. Other species adapted around the edges of that world without participating in it as conceptual actors. The alternate world inherited that same framework at first. Early behavioral science treated troodontid descendants as unusually flexible predators, remarkable in the way octopuses or corvids are remarkable in our world. Their problem-solving abilities attracted funding. Their social dynamics filled journals with careful observation. None of this initially threatened the broader architecture of human self-understanding. Then the evidence accumulated. Behavioral studies documented juveniles learning novel techniques through observation alone, without direct reinforcement. Population groups separated by mountain barriers developed distinct hunting traditions maintained across generations. Certain social displays appeared modified depending on whether human observers were visibly present. In controlled environments, individuals demonstrated delayed gratification capacities previously associated only with higher primates. No single discovery transformed the field. The pressure emerged gradually, like slow tectonic movement beneath stone. The unsettling realization was not that troodontid descendants were approaching human cognition. They were not. No evidence suggested written language, symbolic mathematics, or technological civilization. The unsettling realization was that intelligence might not be a ladder at all. For centuries, cognitive science organized life into stable categories. Reflexive organisms occupied one end. Rational, self-aware humans occupied the other. Every known species fit somewhere between those points. Troodontid descendants resisted placement. Their behavior suggested strategic flexibility exceeding the limits of standard animal cognition, yet lacking the markers traditionally required for personhood. The gap separating humans from every other living thing had narrowed enough to become difficult to describe comfortably, but not enough to disappear. Crows had already destabilized parts of the framework decades earlier. Research on Western scrub jays demonstrated episodic memory, future planning, and theory of mind capacities once considered uniquely human. Dolphins recognized themselves in mirrors. Octopuses solved mechanical puzzles after observation. Each discovery weakened the old taxonomy incrementally. The alternate world simply continued further down that road. Modern cognitive science departments there teach 3 major revisions of behavioral taxonomy within a single century. Each revision triggered by findings the previous system could not accommodate. Graduate students memorize categories abandoned by their advisors only 20 years earlier. Legal scholars debate terminology that philosophers insist remains scientifically premature. One phrase persists despite the disagreement: cognitively proximate, non-human agent. The category exists, because researchers required a placeholder for something that behaved too strategically for traditional animal classifications, yet too inconsistently for human equivalents. Some jurisdictions treat the classification as biologically descriptive only. Others attach partial legal protections to it. And beneath every policy debate and research paper rests a quieter realization. Humanity may not be sharing the planet with an intelligence equal to its own, but it may be sharing it with an intelligence close enough that the old certainty of absolute separation can no longer survive intact. A laboratory octopus unscrewing the lid of a jar does not look, at first glance, like part of the same story as a child learning language or a crow shaping a hook from wire. The movements are too different, the bodies too unfamiliar to one another. Yet beneath the surface of those moments, biology appears to be circling toward the same destination through entirely separate paths. The alternate world forces that realization into focus. For centuries, human civilization treated intelligence as though it were something singular and directional, a ladder beginning with simple organisms and ending with ourselves. Mammalian brains, especially primate brains, became the template against which every other nervous system was measured. The neocortex was considered essential. Hands capable of fine manipulation were considered essential. Certain social structures were considered essential. Then the evidence stopped cooperating. Corvids demonstrated long-term planning despite lacking the mammalian brain architecture once thought necessary for advanced cognition. Ravens solved sequential mechanical puzzles with a flexibility comparable to great apes. New Caledonian crows manufactured tools, modified them for specific tasks, and retained successful designs socially across populations. Octopuses complicated the picture further. Their nervous systems are partially distributed through their arms rather than centralized in a single controlling structure. By older neuroscientific assumptions, such anatomy should have limited cognitive sophistication. Instead, laboratory observations documented exploratory play, environmental manipulation, and stable personality variation between individuals. The pattern that emerged from these discoveries carried an unsettling implication. Intelligence was not appearing once. It was appearing repeatedly. Evolutionary biology calls this convergent evolution, the process through which unrelated lineages independently arrive at similar solutions when exposed to comparable selective pressures. Wings evolved separately in birds, bats, and pterosaurs. Camera-type eyes emerged independently in vertebrates and cephalopods. The alternate world extends this pattern into cognition itself. The true-daunted descendants exist within precisely the conditions that repeatedly generate complex intelligence across Earth's history. They inhabit socially dynamic environments. They compete with other adaptable predators. Survival depends on predicting behavior, maintaining alliances, transmitting knowledge, and adjusting flexibly to changing conditions. For 66 million additional years, those pressures continue operating. The alternate world therefore reveals something larger than dinosaurs surviving extinction. It reveals that intelligence may not be biologically rare in the way human culture once assumed. The underlying ingredients recur too often across evolutionary history to dismiss as accident. What may be rare is something narrower: civilizational intelligence, the specific chain of traits that produces writing, symbolic mathematics, cumulative engineering, agriculture, and deliberate reconstruction of the distant past, appears far less inevitable. Earth generated billions of species across hundreds of millions of years before one lineage crossed that threshold. Even within humanity, That crossing depended on contingencies layered delicately together. Upright posture freed the hands. Climatic instability rewarded flexibility. Social cooperation intensified communication. Fire altered nutrition. Language accelerated memory outside the limits of individual brains. Remove enough links from that chain, and the outcome may never appear. The alternate world changes the emotional shape of this realization. Intelligence no longer resembles a singular crown placed upon one species. Instead, it begins to resemble a recurring biological pressure, surfacing whenever environments reward prediction, cooperation, and behavioral flexibility strongly enough. Humanity remains extraordinary within that pattern, but no longer solitary. And when the thought experiment finally settles into silence, the deepest shift it leaves behind is not about dinosaurs at all. It is about the possibility that minds are not the exception in Earth's history. They may be one of evolution's favorite experiments, attempted again and again through feathers, skin, fur, and nerve tissue, waiting each time to see how far the process can go. Far beyond the orbit of Mars, long before mammals inherited the night forests of Earth, gravity was already arranging the future in silence. The Chicxulub impactor did not begin as catastrophe. It began as orbital mathematics. A fragment of a larger asteroid body drifted within the outer solar system, nudged gradually by collisions and resonance effects across spans of time too large for human intuition to comfortably hold. Jupiter's gravity altered the trajectory further, pulling the object inward through a chain of interactions that unfolded over hundreds of millions of years. Nothing alive participated in that process. No organism observed it. No adaptation could prepare for it. Yet every living human traces their existence back through that invisible sequence of motion. 66 million years ago, the asteroid struck the Yucatan platform at roughly 43,000 miles per hour. Geological evidence suggests an impact angle close to 60 degrees, one of the most destructive configurations possible for energy transfer. The target rock beneath the surface contained enormous sulfur deposits and carbonate sediments. Vaporized instantly, they entered the atmosphere as aerosols dense enough to dim sunlight across the planet. Photosynthesis collapsed first. Then food webs collapsed after it. The extinction event that followed removed roughly 75% of Earth's species, including every non-avian dinosaur lineage. Mammals survived partly because they were small, adaptable, omnivorous, and capable of sheltering underground through the immediate aftermath. Ecological space that had remained closed for over 160 million years suddenly opened. From that opening came everything familiar. Primates emerged within forests reshaped by extinction. Hominins emerged from primates. Language emerged from social pressure and memory. Agriculture emerged from settled communities beside rivers. Cities rose. Religions formed. Music appeared. Astronomy appeared. Someone eventually learned how to reconstruct ancient extinction events from shocked quartz and iridium layers buried in stone. The chain remains unbroken. Remove the asteroid, and the chain dissolves completely. Dinosaurs continue dominating terrestrial ecosystems. Mammals likely remain small and ecologically constrained. The primate lineage never receives the environmental opportunity required for expansion. Human beings do not fail to evolve. They never begin. The alternate world, imagined throughout this story, therefore occupies a strange position in relation to reality. It feels speculative and distant, yet in another sense, it is terrifyingly close. Earth was not separated from that timeline by impossibility. It was separated by orbital circumstance, a slight variation in trajectory, a different gravitational interaction, a miss instead of an impact. The world of migrating hadrosaurs, monitored cities, and trudonid intelligence was, in a literal sense, nearly permanent. For a brief interval measured against cosmic scales, both futures remained physically available to the planet. Then one closed forever. The weight of that realization settles slowly because human cognition prefers stable narratives. People speak about civilization as though it were inevitable, consciousness as though it were destiny, history as though it were marching steadily toward the present moment all along. But the rocks beneath Earth tell a quieter story. Existence is threaded through contingency at every scale. A gravitational disturbance in deep time becomes an extinction event. An extinction event becomes ecological opportunity. Ecological opportunity becomes nervous systems capable of memory and imagination. Eventually, after millions of years of accumulated accidents and survivals, a person lies awake in darkness, listening to a story about worlds that almost existed, and from far enough away, the thought experiment changes shape entirely. The alternate world stops feeling imaginary. Instead, the present world begins to feel astonishingly narrow, balanced, delicately inside a universe where almost everything could have unfolded differently. A crow lands on a streetlight at the edge of a parking lot, tilting its head with the deliberate attention of something trying to solve a small problem. Cars pass beneath it. A person carrying groceries crosses the pavement without looking up. The bird watches anyway, holding faces in memory with a precision most people never notice. The alternate world imagined throughout this story feels louder than ours. Its highways pause for migrating giants. Its cities pulse with alert systems and monitored boundaries. Its laws bend around the territorial claims of creatures powerful enough to reshape civilization through their existence alone. Our world appears quieter by comparison, yet the silence is misleading. Every bird alive today is a dinosaur, not metaphorically or symbolically, but taxonomically. Under modern cladistic classification, birds exist within Dinosauria as directly as humans exist within Mammalia. The distinction between bird and dinosaur survives mostly because language changes more slowly than science. Outside the window, the lineage continues. There are approximately 10,500 living bird species on Earth today, more than all mammal species combined. Their forms occupy nearly every ecological niche available to vertebrate life. Penguins move through Antarctic water with the density of marine predators. Hummingbirds suspend themselves in air through metabolic rates so extreme they resemble living combustion. Ravens cooperate, deceive, remember, and adapt with startling behavioral flexibility. An estimated 200 to 400 billion birds are alive across the planet at this moment. Forests, coastlines, deserts, industrial districts, suburbs, fishing harbors, mountain valleys, and crowded cities all carry traces of a lineage that survived the extinction event and continued diversifying for another 66 million years. The realization shifts the thought experiment quietly sideways. The alternate world was never truly a world where dinosaurs survived. Dinosaurs survived here as well. One branch vanished. Another remained airborne and kept evolving through every age that followed. The crow from the opening scene carries cognitive machinery shaped across roughly 250 million years of theropod evolution. Facial recognition studies demonstrate that crows can identify specific humans years after a negative interaction occurred. More remarkably, they communicate that information socially. Birds with no direct contact to the original event learn which faces to avoid through observation alone. The behavior feels startling, partly because it narrows distance. Ancient extinction events often seem abstract when imagined through skeletons locked behind museum glass. Feathers disrupt that distance. A raven solving a puzzle in a laboratory, or a pigeon navigating a dense city street reminds the modern world that dinosaur evolution never fully disappeared into stone. It adapted. The alternate timeline imagined enormous terrestrial descendants continuing across plains and forests. Our timeline produced flocks crossing oceans guided by magnetic fields, parrots capable of symbolic vocabulary, and corvids flexible enough to thrive beside human civilization itself. The dinosaurs did not lose the planet, they transformed with it. And perhaps that is why the imagined alternate world feels emotionally powerful in the first place. It appears at first to describe something missing, a road history failed to take. Yet by the end, the boundary between the imagined world and the real one becomes thinner than expected. The dinosaurs are not absent from modern Earth. They are woven through its mornings already. Their descendants perch on power lines, move through rainstorms, gather outside restaurants, and sing before dawn from unseen branches in the dark. The question that began this story, therefore, settles into a quieter form than anyone expected. The world where dinosaurs survived is not entirely imaginary. It is the world that has been surrounding humanity all along. At dusk, a flock of starlings folds across the sky in shifting waves, changing direction so quickly that the movement appears liquid rather than biological. Thousands of bodies turn together without collision, each bird adjusting through tiny calculations repeated continuously in motion. From the ground, the flock resembles a single organism thinking with many wings. The alternate world imagined throughout this story offered a louder version of coexistence. Highways halted for migrating herds, cities listened for infrasound beneath the pavement. Governments built entire legal systems around animals, intelligent enough to complicate philosophy itself. Yet, beneath all of that spectacle rested something quieter, something already present in the ordinary world. The title asked, what would happen if dinosaurs never died? The softer answer is that they did not. Not in the dramatic form of towering hadrosaurs crossing commuter roads or predator alerts vibrating inside a pocket. The surviving version is smaller, feathered, and so familiar that most people pass it daily without recognizing what they are seeing. A crow perched on a telephone wire is the continuation of an ancient theropod lineage that endured one of the worst extinction events in Earth's history. The nervous system inside its skull carries evolutionary refinements accumulated across immense spans of geological time. It remembers faces, it solves sequential problems. It transmits information socially between unrelated individuals. These are not isolated curiosities. Hummingbirds memorize the spatial arrangement and nectar replenishment schedules of flowers distributed across territories spanning several acres, updating those internal maps constantly while hovering in three-dimensional space with metabolic demands among the highest known in vertebrate biology. Clark's nutcrackers hide tens of thousands of seeds across mountain terrain and relocate them months later beneath snow cover with astonishing accuracy. Ravens engage in deceptive caching behavior, pretending to hide food in false locations when they suspect observation by competitors. Each behavior represents cognition shaped patiently by selection pressures, operating far older than humanity itself. The murmuration of starlings carries another layer of complexity. Computational scientists have spent decades studying the mathematical structure underlying coordinated flock motion because no centralized leader directs it. The flock functions through distributed decision-making, local awareness, generating large-scale order through countless small interactions. Modern robotics research models swarm coordination partly from these systems. Attempting to replicate efficiencies, birds evolved naturally. The alternate world, therefore, changes shape once more near the end of the thought experiment. It stops functioning purely as speculative fiction and begins acting as contrast, illuminating details reality already contains. Dinosaurs survived the asteroid, not by preserving their old forms unchanged, but by transforming successfully enough to enter every ecosystem on the planet. They inhabit coastlines, wetlands, forests, tundra, deserts, and crowded cities. They migrate overhead at night beyond the range of streetlights. They sing before sunrise from hidden branches. Their descendants outnumber mammals globally by enormous margins. Human civilization developed beside them the entire time. What changed was knowledge. Modern biology removed the final separation between bird and dinosaur, revealing continuity where earlier generations imagined disappearance. The pigeon crossing a train platform and the raven investigating a campsite now belong to a story extending backward, beyond mammals, beyond grasslands, beyond humanity itself. And once that realization settles fully into place, the alternate world no longer feels entirely separate from the real one. The distance between them narrows into perspective. The dinosaurs never truly vanished from Earth. They simply became quiet enough that people forgot to notice them. Imagine the history of Earth compressed into a single, quiet day. Midnight arrives with oceans still empty of anything that could be called an animal. For hours, the planet belongs only to chemistry and microscopic persistence, cells dividing invisibly beneath ancient seas while continents drift through darkness under a younger moon. By late evening, complexity finally begins to bloom. Soft-bodied organisms spread across shallow water. Forests rise, insects appear, reptiles follow. Then, at approximately 10:40 p.m., the dinosaurs arrive. For the next hour and 18 minutes of this imagined day, they dominate the surface of the planet with extraordinary evolutionary success. Their bodies diversify into forms suited for nearly every terrestrial environment Earth can produce. Some lineages grow immense, reshaping forests simply by moving through them. Others become fast, social, visually sophisticated predators with enlarged sensory systems and increasingly complex behavior. Feathered species experiment with gliding, then flight, then aerial ecosystems that eventually fill the skies completely. The world changes around them continuously. Continents separate, climates fluctuate, inland seas appear and retreat, flowering plants spread across landscapes that had never known them before. Through all of it, the dinosaur lineage persists. And then, with 4 seconds left before midnight, humans appear. Those final seconds contain everything familiar to civilization: agriculture, writing, empires, philosophy, mathematics, electricity, satellites, nuclear weapons, the internet, machines leaving the solar system carrying fragments of human language into interstellar darkness. In 4 seconds, one species transformed the chemistry of the atmosphere, redirected rivers, extracted carbon buried across geological ages, and altered extinction rates so rapidly that paleontologists now debate whether the present qualifies as a sixth mass extinction event. Measured against the scale of evolutionary time, the speed is astonishingly abrupt. The dinosaurs possessed far longer. In the compressed day, they held the planet for more than an hour before the asteroid arrived. Yet the fossil record contains no clear evidence of industrial civilization, no preserved cities, no technological layer equivalent to the one humans have embedded into rock, plastic, concrete, and atmospheric carbon. This absence appears straightforward at first glance, but the fossil record is selective in ways that are easy to underestimate. Bone mineralizes readily. Teeth survive pressure and time with remarkable durability. Behavioral sophistication does not fossilize easily. Language leaves almost no trace. Social systems vanish completely unless encoded indirectly into nesting sites, trackways, or unusual groupings of skeletons preserved by improbable conditions. Even tool use can disappear if the tools were biological, temporary, or environmentally degradable. What survives from the final million years of the Cretaceous is therefore fragmentary, scattered like isolated frames from an immense film whose continuity has mostly dissolved. Paleontology reconstructs worlds from these fragments with extraordinary rigor, but uncertainty remains woven through the process. And within those fragments, already recovered, the cognitive picture has shifted repeatedly over the last century. Dinosaurs, once imagined as slow and mechanically instinctive, are now understood as active, socially dynamic animals with complex sensory lives and behavioral flexibility extending far beyond earlier assumptions. The 4 human seconds, therefore, become harder to interpret cleanly. Perhaps civilizational intelligence truly requires an exceptionally narrow chain of evolutionary circumstances, one that emerged once through improbable convergence and may never emerge again. Or perhaps intelligence itself is not rare, while technological civilization is. The compressed clock offers no final answer. It only reveals proportion. 4 seconds is enough time for a species to split the atom, map its own genome, and imagine alternate histories in which another lineage inherited the future instead. And against the depth of the surrounding day, the existence of those 4 seconds begins to feel less inevitable than miraculous. Near dusk, in many parts of the world, the sky briefly fills with motion that seems almost impossible to count. Thousands of starlings turn together above fields and rooftops, folding and unfolding across the air like a single living structure. No central leader directs the movement. No map exists. Each bird tracks only a handful of nearby bodies, adjusting position in fractions of a second, and from those countless tiny calculations emerges coherence vast enough to reshape the sky itself. For most of human history, scenes like this were treated as background. Beautiful, perhaps, but secondary. Decorative. The world belonged to humanity, and everything else existed somewhere below the level of real significance. The alternate world dissolves that assumption completely. Its people grow up with the undeniable knowledge that intelligence is not isolated inside the human species. It waits beyond perimeter fences, watches from forests older than nations, migrates across continents, according to routes remembered longer than civilization has existed. Entire legal systems emerge from that awareness. Entire philosophies bend around it. Yet the strange, quiet truth hidden beneath the thought experiment is that our own world has never been empty of this realization. We simply became skilled at overlooking it. The crow balanced on a telephone wire carries neural machinery shaped by a lineage older than the mountains beneath it. Its descendants learned to recognize human faces, communicate danger socially, solve sequential mechanical problems, and remember specific individuals for years. The hummingbird hovering beside a flowering branch maintains spatial maps of feeding territories with extraordinary precision, returning to nectar sources at intervals calibrated to the metabolic rhythms of the plant itself. Far above open oceans, Albatrosses navigate across thousands of miles using magnetic sensing, atmospheric gradients, and environmental memory distributed across migrations longer than many human journeys through history. None of these abilities appeared suddenly. They are ancient solutions refined through immense spans of evolutionary time, preserved because they worked. Then came the impact. 66 million years ago, sunlight dimmed behind debris suspended high in the atmosphere. Photosynthesis collapsed across much of the planet. Food chains fractured. Temperatures shifted violently. Forests burned, then vanished beneath darkness and cold. Most large dinosaur lineages disappeared into extinction within a geological instant. But one feathered branch endured. Not through dominance, not through physical power. Survival favored flexibility instead. Small bodies requiring fewer calories. Generalist diets capable of shifting toward seeds, insects, or carrion. Rapid reproduction. Behavioral adaptability. Persistence. The descendants of those survivors now fill every continent on Earth. When a pigeon crosses a station platform or a raven calls from the edge of a winter road, the moment contains an almost impossible continuity. The living animal and the vanished world are connected by an unbroken biological thread stretching backward beyond mammals, beyond grasslands, beyond humanity itself. And the same continuity exists within us. Every organism alive today represents a lineage that survived every catastrophe capable of ending it. Ice ages, volcanic winters, drought cycles, epidemics, continental rearrangements, the asteroid itself. Existence moves through time not as permanence, but as survival repeated continuously across impossible odds, which means the weight of being here is larger than it first appears. A person lying awake in darkness, listening to distant traffic, and imagining alternate histories is not separate from the ancient story being imagined. The thought itself is part of the continuity. 4 billion years of uninterrupted survival, adaptation, and contingency had to hold together precisely long enough for consciousness to briefly look backward and realize how fragile the chain always was. Late at night, after the machinery of daily life has gone quiet, human thought tends to drift toward the same small cluster of questions. Civilizations, separated by oceans and centuries, have framed them differently, wrapped them in different religions or philosophies or scientific vocabularies, yet the structure beneath them remains strangely constant. Are we alone? Are we inevitable? Does any of this mean something? The alternate world reshapes all three, not by replacing them with certainty, but by changing the scale on which they are asked. In that world, intelligence is not isolated within humanity. It exists elsewhere in forms that evolved independently, under different anatomical constraints and across different ecological histories. The theropod descendants occupying forests and mountain corridors force the civilization around them to abandon the comforting assumption that cognition belongs naturally to mammals or to primates or to us specifically. And our own world has already been moving quietly toward the same conclusion. Crows manufacture tools. Dolphins transmit learned hunting strategies culturally across generations. Octopuses solve mechanical puzzles with nervous systems fundamentally unlike any vertebrate architecture. Whales coordinate socially across distances through acoustic communication that travels entire ocean basins. Evolution has approached intelligence repeatedly, using different biological materials each time, as though problem-solving itself is a landscape life keeps rediscovering from multiple directions. The universe begins to feel less empty under that realization. Not necessarily populated by civilizations, not necessarily crowded with minds building telescopes beneath alien skies, but filled at least with the recurring tendency for matter to organize itself into systems capable of memory, adaptation, prediction, and awareness. The second question shifts more painfully. The alternate world makes visible how contingent human existence actually is. Remove one asteroid impact, alter one gravitational interaction in the outer solar system hundreds of millions of years earlier. Change the angle of atmospheric entry slightly. Shift the mineral composition of the impact site away from sulfur-rich rock. Interrupt one fragile branch of primate evolution before it stabilizes. And the species imagining all of this disappears before it begins. In ordinary life, inevitability feels emotionally natural. The world appears built around human presence because every structure visible within civilization was made by humans. Streets, languages, music, satellites, books, laws, all reinforce the illusion that intelligence like ours was always the intended outcome. The deeper scientific view dissolves that comfort almost completely. Homo sapiens emerges not as destiny, but as contingency layered upon contingency, a sequence of improbabilities surviving long enough to become self-aware. The alternate timeline where dinosaurs remain dominant is not fantastical in the scientific sense. It is frighteningly plausible. 30 minutes of cosmic timing separate the two worlds. And then the final question arrives. Science can describe the mechanisms that produced consciousness. It can trace the chemistry of stars into the carbon structure of living cells. It can reconstruct evolutionary pathways across geological time with astonishing precision, but meaning remains outside measurement. Yet contingency changes the emotional texture of the question. A universe where consciousness emerges inevitably from physical law carries one kind of philosophical weight. A universe where consciousness appears only after billions of years of instability, extinction, survival, and impossible coincidence carries another. The rarity itself begins to matter. Perhaps meaning is not diminished by fragility. Perhaps fragility is what creates it. A species capable of understanding the accidents that produced it may still be temporary, still finite, still cosmically small, but within the known history of Earth, it is also unprecedented. And somewhere within that tension, between insignificance and impossibility, the three questions continue drifting quietly through the dark, waiting for minds capable of asking them again. Somewhere in the mountains of the alternate world, long after midnight, a maintenance light is glowing inside a monitoring station, built beside a migration corridor, older than humanity itself. A movement report is open on a screen. 340 animals crossed at 7:43 in the morning. Traffic paused for 22 minutes. No panic behavior was observed. Calves remained centered within the herd. The route alignment matched the previous 6-year average within acceptable deviation. The report will enter a database containing decades of accumulated crossings, weather patterns, birth rates, vegetation density maps, stress indicators, and acoustic recordings gathered from the low resonant calls moving through the herd before dawn. By next spring, predictive models will use the information to estimate the following migration window with slightly greater precision. And when the morning arrives again, vehicles will idle quietly beside the road while bodies older than civilization move north through the mist. A child watching from the back seat will press both hands against the glass. An exhausted commuter will check the delay notification on a dashboard screen, then look up despite themselves. Someone seeing the herd for the 1,000th time will still fall silent for a moment as the animals pass. The world will continue in all its layered complexity, expensive to maintain, politically divided, scientifically unresolved, yet threaded constantly with the awareness that humanity shares its existence with another ancient intelligence moving alongside it through time. Our own world feels quieter on the surface. The highways remain open. The warning systems stay dormant. No migration corridor interrupts the architecture of ordinary mornings. Yet outside the pools of electric light surrounding human life, the descendants of the same ancient lineage remain present. In the dark branches above a sleeping street, a crow shifts position and remembers the face of a person it encountered years earlier. Somewhere over black water, an albatross follows magnetic gradients, invisible to human senses, while crossing an ocean basin without landmarks. In a garden before sunrise, a hummingbird returns to flowers, according to intervals measured internally with astonishing precision. These are not echoes of the dinosaur age. They are the dinosaur age, still unfolding. The asteroid arrived. Dust and sulfur entered the atmosphere. Forests collapsed beneath darkness. Entire dynasties of gigantic animals vanished from the planet forever. Yet one feathered branch persisted through cold, hunger, and ecological ruin, with enough resilience to carry its lineage forward into a future no organism living then could possibly have imagined. 66 million years later, those survivors occupy every continent on Earth, and another improbable lineage, shaped by its own chain of catastrophes and narrow survivals, developed nervous systems capable of reconstructing the story. That may be the strangest part of all. Not merely that dinosaurs survived, or that intelligence emerged, or that consciousness learned to ask questions about extinction and contingency beneath the night sky. It is that the universe produced a mind capable of understanding that it exists inside a chain of accidents stretching backward across geological time. The alternate world was worth imagining because it revealed something hidden inside the real one. The highways could have belonged to hadrosaurs. The forests could have belonged to troodontids. The oceans could have remained under the dominion of marine reptiles. Instead, the world turned slightly differently. A rock arrived at a particular angle. One lineage disappeared. Another endured. And now, tonight, on a planet balanced delicately between contingency and survival, the descendants of dinosaurs are sleeping in the trees outside your window while you lie awake long enough to know they are there. Rest now. The dinosaurs are still keeping watch.